De ro. Min seap dung dung kak qui tak nai cho Part 1. Ban de ko tu de va outline moi chua. Gue min tu de plus outline, min se viet Part 1 koang 500 to 602, voy opening 80 to 152 bam sat hook man, leverage cu the, ngoi Thursday not, cinematic, real-time theo ky thuit de training. I need the text of Part 1, or at least the title and outline, to continue Part 2 consistently with the same characters, setting, timeline, and conflict. Without that context, I cannot reliably write a matching continuation. The conference room stayed silent long after the last executive finished speaking. I stood near the wall with my tablet tucked against my chest and watched them study the numbers again. The air smelled faintly of coffee, printer toner, and the lemon polish the cleaning crew used every morning. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, gray clouds drifted over the river. Inside, something had shifted. They were no longer dismissing the warning. They were looking for proof. The chief operations officer adjusted his glasses and zoomed in on the infrastructure map projected across the screen. A network of pumping stations, utility corridors, and control nodes stretched across 3 counties. Millions of gallons of water moved through that system every day. Hospitals depended on it. Schools depended on it. Entire neighborhoods depended on it. And one section on the map was flashing red. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me. The feeling should have made me nervous. Instead, it made me focus. I stepped closer to the screen. The issue starts here, I said. If they close this access corridor during the redevelopment phase, maintenance crews cannot reach the primary pressure station in under 30 minutes. A few executives exchanged uneasy glances. One man leaned back in his chair. That delay cannot be that serious. I looked at him. It becomes serious when a backup valve fails during peak demand. The room went quiet again. I tapped another section of the map. And if that happens here, pressure drops across 3 service districts. Someone inhaled sharply. The chief executive folded his hands. He was no longer smiling. How many people are affected, he asked. Potentially over 100,000. The number seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. No one reached for their coffee. No one checked their phone. I could hear the soft hum of the ventilation system above us. A few hours earlier they had treated the project like a routine approval. Now it felt different. Larger. More dangerous. The chief executive stood and walked toward the window. His reflection stretched across the glass. And nobody on my team caught this. Nobody answered. The silence said enough. I glanced down at the stack of documents spread across the table. Most people saw contracts. Most people saw budgets. I saw flow paths. Pressure loads. Emergency access routes. Years of field reports hidden beneath legal language. That was the problem. The mistake was buried where nobody expected to look. A notification appeared on my tablet. One new message. Then another. Then 3 more. My stomach tightened. The engineering department had started responding to the files I requested earlier that morning. I opened the first attachment. My pulse quickened. There it was. A maintenance report from 8 months ago. Then another from 6 months ago. Then another. The same warning repeated again and again. Restricted access would create a major vulnerability. The reports had been filed. Reviewed. And ignored. I lifted my eyes toward the executives. There is something else you need to see. Chairs shifted. The chief executive turned back toward me. I connected the tablet to the display. One by one the reports appeared on the giant screen. Dates. Signatures. Internal approvals. Evidence. The room seemed colder now. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally the company lawyer cleared her throat. These reports should have triggered a full review. They did, I said quietly. Someone chose not to act. The words landed harder than I intended. A distant rumble of thunder rolled beyond the windows. The city lights flickered beneath the darkening sky. The chief executive stared at the screen without blinking. Whatever this had been at the start of the day, it was no longer a simple oversight. Somewhere inside the company, someone had seen the risk, understood the consequences, and pushed the project forward anyway. And for the first time, I realized the real problem was not hidden inside the infrastructure. It was sitting much closer than any of us wanted to believe. Nobody moved. The reports remained frozen on the screen while the storm outside pressed dark clouds against the glass. I could hear the faint buzz of the projector and the distant rumble of thunder somewhere beyond the river. The chief executive stood with one hand on the conference table. His knuckles had turned pale. A few minutes earlier the room had been debating schedules and budgets. Now everyone was staring at a trail of warnings that stretched back almost a year. The company lawyer adjusted the stack of documents in front of her and leaned closer to the screen. "Who signed off on these reviews?" she asked. I tapped another file. A signature appeared. Then another. Then another. The same name kept returning. The silence deepened. One executive slowly removed his glasses. Another shifted in his chair and looked toward the end of the table. I followed his gaze. Richard Hale sat perfectly still. His tailored navy suit looked as sharp as it had that morning. His expression had not changed. Not even slightly. That was what bothered me most. Everyone else looked surprised. Richard looked prepared. "There has to be context," he said calmly. His voice carried across the room like a stone skipping across still water. Infrastructure projects generate hundreds of reports. Not every concern becomes a crisis. Nobody answered right away. The chief executive looked toward him. "You approved these recommendations?" Richard folded his hands. "I approved a redevelopment plan supported by 3 consulting firms and 6 department reviews." The lawyer narrowed her eyes. "Including reports that identified a critical access risk." Richard did not blink. Potential risk. The distinction sounded small. It did not feel small. I opened another attachment. My stomach tightened again. This file was newer than the others. 3 weeks old. I had not seen it before. The timestamp glowed at the top of the page. The engineering division had requested an emergency reassessment after discovering additional pressure fluctuations near the primary station. The recommendation section was highlighted in yellow. Immediate review required. I swallowed. There is another report. Every eye shifted back toward me. The room suddenly felt warmer. The air seemed heavier. I enlarged the file and projected it onto the screen. The response was immediate. Chairs creaked. Someone muttered under their breath. The chief executive walked closer. Why was this never presented to the board? Nobody answered. Richard finally looked away from the table. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty flickered across his face. It lasted less than a second. Then it vanished. "I have never seen that document," he said. The words hung in the air. I stared at the timestamp. Then at the approval chain below it. A digital receipt sat attached to the file. Opened. Reviewed. Archived. The record showed exactly when it happened. Exactly who accessed it. The lawyer noticed it at the same moment I did. Her eyes sharpened. "That is impossible." Richard remained silent. Rain began tapping against the windows. Soft at first. Then harder. The city skyline blurred behind streaks of water. The chief executive slowly lowered himself into his chair. The movement seemed to age him several years. How much would a failure cost? He asked quietly. Nobody needed clarification. I understood the question immediately. Financially? I asked. He nodded. I looked at the latest assessment. Several $billion in direct impact. A long pause followed. And service disruption? Hospitals, schools, emergency response facilities, residential districts. The list felt endless. Nobody spoke while I continued reading. Recovery could take months. The words settled over the room like cold fog. Richard leaned back in his chair. His confidence was fading now. I could see it around the edges. Tiny signs. A tighter jaw. Slower breathing. Fingers tapping once against the armrest. The chief executive finally looked up. His voice remained calm, but something beneath it had hardened. Effective immediately, all redevelopment activity is suspended. Nobody objected. Nobody argued. The decision was too obvious now. Outside, lightning flashed beyond the river, turning the windows white for an instant. The room glowed and then returned to shadow. My tablet vibrated again. Another message. Another file. Another engineering update. I opened it and felt my pulse jump. This one was not from engineering. It was from internal compliance. The subject line was only 6 words long. Unauthorized document suppression review. And suddenly I realized the infrastructure problem was only the beginning. The notification remained on my screen while the storm intensified outside. Rain streamed down the glass in twisting silver lines, turning the skyline into a blur of lights and shadows. Nobody in the room seemed to notice anymore. Every ounce of attention had shifted toward the growing pile of evidence sitting in front of us. I opened the compliance file carefully. The timestamp showed it had been created just 4 days earlier. Someone inside the company had started asking questions before any of us walked into this conference room. My fingertips felt cold against the edge of the tablet. There is another report, I said. The chief executive looked exhausted now. Show us. I connected the file to the projector. A new document appeared across the screen. The heading was simple. Internal Compliance Review. Beneath it sat a series of audit notes. Access logs. Document histories. Authorization records. The lawyer stood and moved closer. Her heels clicked softly against the hardwood floor. Nobody interrupted her. She scanned the first page. Then the second. Then the third. Her expression changed. This was not an accident, she said quietly. The room went still. The words seemed heavier than everything that came before them. Richard Hale shifted in his chair. It was subtle, but I noticed. Until now he had appeared completely controlled. Now there was tension in the corners of his eyes. The compliance review identified multiple instances where engineering concerns had been rerouted away from board review channels. The reports had not disappeared. They had simply been redirected into internal archives where almost nobody would ever see them. Can we verify this? One executive asked. His voice sounded smaller than before. The lawyer nodded. The audit trail is embedded in the system. I enlarged the next page. User activity records filled the screen. Dates. Times. File movements. Approval changes. Every action left a footprint. Every footprint led in the same direction. The rain hammered harder against the windows. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the river. For a moment the conference room glowed white. Then the shadows returned. The chief executive folded his arms. How many reports? I continued scrolling. At least 17. A low breath escaped from someone near the far end of the table. 17 separate warnings. 17 opportunities to stop the problem before it reached this point. The number seemed impossible. Yet there it was. Recorded line by line. Richard finally leaned forward. "You are building a narrative from incomplete information." His voice remained calm, but the confidence underneath it was weaker now. The lawyer turned toward him. "Then help us understand the complete information." Richard opened his mouth, then stopped. The hesitation lasted only a second. It was enough. I had spent years studying infrastructure systems. Pressure changes. Failure points. Risk indicators. One thing I learned was simple. Problems reveal themselves through patterns. Human behavior does the same thing. The chief executive noticed it too. I could see it in his eyes. He was no longer evaluating reports. He was evaluating people. Another notification appeared on my tablet. Then another. Engineering staff from 3 different departments had started responding to the emergency inquiry. New messages arrived faster than I could open them. One subject line caught my attention immediately. Field access restrictions. I clicked it. A photograph appeared. Then another. Then another. Images from inspection crews. Locked service gates. Construction barriers. Detours that added nearly 40 minutes to emergency response times. My pulse quickened. "You need to see this." The photographs filled the screen. The room reacted instantly. Several executives stood from their chairs. One stepped closer to the display. Another shook his head slowly. The barriers were already being installed. The redevelopment project had moved further than anyone realized. This was no longer a future risk. It was happening now. The chief executive stared at the photographs without speaking. His jaw tightened. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Deep. Distant. Relentless. Then he looked toward the operations calendar projected beside the reports. His face changed. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "What happens tomorrow morning?" I followed his gaze. A scheduled infrastructure transition. Final phase activation. The room suddenly felt smaller. The lawyer looked down at the date. Then back at the screen. Nobody said a word for several seconds. Because every person in that room understood the same thing at the same moment. We had not uncovered a past mistake. We were standing less than 24 hours away from watching it become a crisis. The realization settled over the room with frightening speed. Less than 24 hours. That was all that stood between a warning on a screen and consequences nobody could fully predict. The storm outside seemed to understand before we did. Rain slammed against the windows in steady waves. The skyline had almost disappeared behind sheets of gray. The chief executive rose from his chair so suddenly that several people looked up. "Call operations," he said. "Now." Phones appeared across the table. The quiet conference room transformed into controlled urgency. Voices stayed low, but movement filled every corner. Messages were sent. Calls were placed. Calendars were opened. I remained standing beside the projector, staring at the transition schedule. The activation was set for 8 o'clock the next morning. Less than 18 hours away now. The operations director finally lowered his phone. "The field crews are already preparing." Nobody liked hearing that. The lawyer closed her folder. "Can we stop it?" The question lingered. The operations director hesitated. That hesitation told us everything. "Technically yes," he said. "But not instantly. Notifications have already gone out to contractors, vendors, and municipal partners." The chief executive rubbed a hand across his forehead. "Then start making calls." Another flash of lightning illuminated the room. For an instant every face appeared sharp and pale against the darkness. Then the light vanished. Richard Hale remained seated. His expression was harder to read now. Not calm. Not nervous. Calculating. He watched the room the way a man watches a chessboard after realizing several pieces have moved without his notice. I checked the latest engineering messages. More files were arriving every minute. One engineer attached photographs from a pressure station inspection completed just 3 days earlier. Another included maintenance logs showing delayed access drills. The pattern kept growing. Every document pointed in the same direction. The danger had been visible for months. It simply had not been acknowledged. A soft chime sounded from the conference room speakerphone. Someone had connected the regional infrastructure manager. His voice crackled through the system. I just received the suspension notice. Is this real? The chief executive answered immediately. Yes. Silence followed. Then a long exhale. Thank God. Several people exchanged looks. The reaction surprised them. It surprised me too. Explain, the chief executive said. The manager cleared his throat. Field teams have been raising concerns for weeks. Nobody wanted to push harder because approvals were already finalized. The room grew still again. You are saying employees knew? The lawyer asked. A lot of them did. The answer landed heavily. I thought about the maintenance reports. The engineering warnings. The photographs. The compliance review. None of those documents had appeared out of nowhere. People had tried to speak. Their concerns simply never reached the right ears. The chief executive slowly sat down. He looked older than he had that morning. How many? He asked. The manager hesitated. Probably dozens. The rain continued drumming against the glass. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The company had spent months trusting reports, approvals, and signatures while the people closest to the system watched the risk grow. My tablet vibrated again. Another message. This one came from a senior technician stationed at the primary pressure facility. The subject line immediately caught my attention. Personal request. I opened it. The message was short. Only 2 sentences. Please do not let them activate tomorrow. We barely managed to stabilize pressure levels during the last test cycle. My chest tightened. Attached below the message was a chart. I opened it and froze. The pressure fluctuations were worse than any previous report suggested. Much worse. Peaks. Drops. Recovery delays. The graph looked unstable. Dangerous. I connected it to the projector without saying a word. The room studied the chart. One executive whispered something under his breath. Another leaned closer. The chief executive stared at the numbers for a long time. Then he looked toward Richard. Not with anger. Not with disbelief. With disappointment. The kind that cuts deeper because it arrives after trust has already been broken. Richard looked away first. Outside, thunder rolled across the city once more. Deep and distant. Inside, nobody seemed focused on him anymore. Because the problem had grown beyond one person. Beyond one decision. Beyond one project. We were finally seeing the full picture. And the full picture revealed something even more unsettling. The people who had tried to prevent this crisis had been speaking all along. The company had simply stopped listening. For the first time that day, nobody seemed interested in defending a position. The conference room had moved beyond debate. The questions were different now. Not who approved what. Not which department missed a warning. The question hanging over every person in the room was much simpler. How close had they come to making a mistake that could have affected thousands of families? The storm outside began to ease. Rain still traced long paths down the glass, but the thunder had drifted farther away. The city lights slowly returned beyond the river. I stood beside the screen reviewing the latest messages arriving from field crews. Every few minutes another technician sent information. More photographs. More maintenance notes. More evidence that people on the ground had recognized the danger long before executives ever saw it. The chief executive remained silent for a long time. His fingers rested on the conference table. He stared at the pressure chart projected across the wall. The uneven spikes looked almost alive. Finally he spoke. I want every field supervisor included in tomorrow morning's review. Several executives looked surprised. He noticed. If they understand the system better than we do, then they belong in the room. Nobody argued. The statement felt overdue. The operations director nodded immediately. I can arrange that. The lawyer closed her notebook and leaned back. Compliance will begin a formal investigation first thing tomorrow. Her voice was calm, but firm. Document suppression, reporting failures, approval procedures. Everything. Across the table, Richard Hale said nothing. He looked smaller now. Not physically. Professionally. The confidence that had once filled the room around him seemed to have evaporated. I did not feel satisfaction. I expected that I would. Instead I felt tired. The kind of tiredness that settles into your shoulders after carrying something heavy for too long. Maybe it was because this had never been about proving someone wrong. It had always been about preventing something worse. My tablet vibrated again. Another message from the senior technician at the pressure facility. This one included a photograph taken less than an hour earlier. I opened it. The image showed a maintenance crew standing beside a large control valve. Their reflective jackets glowed beneath bright work lights. One technician held a clipboard. Another pointed toward the equipment. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Just people doing their jobs. I stared at the photograph longer than I expected. The chief executive noticed. What is it? He asked. I turned the screen toward him. He studied the image. Field crew. I nodded. They stayed late tonight. The room grew quiet again. The photograph moved slowly from person to person. Nobody rushed. Nobody dismissed it. For months those workers had filed reports, raised concerns, and documented risks. Most of them would never sit in a boardroom. Most would never appear in a company newsletter. Yet they were. The reason we were having this conversation now. The lawyer smiled faintly. Looks like they care more than some executives. A few people laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because it was true. The tension eased for the first time all evening. Outside, the clouds began to break apart. A narrow strip of moonlight appeared above the river. Its reflection shimmered across the dark water. The chief executive stood and walked toward the window. He watched the city for several seconds before speaking again. Tomorrow we fix this. His voice was quiet. Nobody applauded. Nobody made speeches. They simply nodded. One by one. Around the table. The operations director. The lawyer. Department heads. Engineers connected through speakerphones. Even people who had barely spoken all day. I looked back at the photograph on my tablet. The maintenance crew was still standing beneath those bright lights, unaware that their warnings had finally reached the people who needed to hear them. And as the storm drifted away from the city, I realized something important. The most valuable part of any system is not the technology, the infrastructure, or the executives who oversee it. It is the people willing to speak up when something is wrong, even when nobody seems to be listening. The conference room finally began to empty a little after midnight. Not completely. Nobody was ready to leave yet. Coffee cups sat forgotten beside stacks of reports. Laptop screens cast pale light across the dark wood table. Outside, the storm had moved east, leaving the city washed clean beneath a sky slowly clearing. I remained near the window for a moment, watching reflections ripple across the river. The building felt different now. Earlier it had been filled with certainty. Now it felt honest. The chief executive stood beside the operations director studying a revised schedule. Every transition planned for the morning had been suspended. Contractors were being notified. Municipal partners were receiving updates. Emergency review teams were being assembled before sunrise. The work continued quietly. Nobody complained about the hour. The lawyer gathered her folders into a neat stack and approached me. "You should go home," she said. I smiled faintly. "You first." That earned the first genuine laugh I had heard all day. It was small, but it softened something in the room. Across the table, several department heads were reviewing field reports together. Earlier they had sat in separate corners protecting separate interests. Now they were comparing notes. Asking questions. Listening. The change was subtle. Important things often are. My tablet vibrated again. Another message from the primary pressure station. I opened it immediately. This time it was not a report. It was a photograph. The same maintenance crew stood together beneath bright work lights. Someone had brought pizza. Another technician held up a paper cup of coffee. Their faces looked tired. Relieved too. Beneath the image was a short note. "Thank you for hearing us." I stared at the screen longer than I expected. The words were simple. Yet they carried more weight than any presentation or audit. For months those workers had spoken into a system that never answered back. Tonight, for the first time, they knew somebody had listened. I showed the message to the chief executive. He read it silently. Then he looked down at the photograph again. "What are their names?" he asked. The question surprised me. "I can find out." He nodded. "Please do." A few minutes later he requested the names of every field supervisor who had submitted concerns during the past year. No speeches. No announcements. Just a quiet request. But I understood what it meant. Recognition was finally moving in the right direction. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, another conference call connected through the speaker system. Several supervisors joined from remote facilities across the region. Their voices sounded tired but alert. For the next hour they walked executives through conditions on the ground. Access routes. Equipment concerns. Maintenance schedules. Nobody interrupted them. Nobody dismissed their observations. The people closest to the system were finally leading the conversation. As I listened, I noticed something unexpected. The atmosphere in the room felt lighter despite the seriousness of the situation. Not because the danger had disappeared. Because truth was replacing assumption. Every answer created clarity. Every question uncovered another piece of reality. Around 2 in the morning, the final review concluded. The emergency transition was officially cancelled. Independent inspections would begin at daylight. Compliance investigations would move forward. Risk assessments would be rebuilt from the ground up. The chief executive closed his notebook and looked around the room. Exhaustion showed on every face. Yet there was something else too. Resolve. Nobody celebrated. There was nothing to celebrate. They had come dangerously close to a major failure. But they had stopped it in time. That mattered. As people gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, I glanced once more at the photograph from the maintenance crew. Bright lights. Reflective jackets. Ordinary people standing beside equipment most citizens would never think about. The city would wake up in a few hours without ever knowing how close it had come to a different morning. And maybe that was the point. The strongest systems are not the ones that never face problems. They are the ones where enough people care to speak up before those problems become disasters. By the time I stepped out of the building, the sky was beginning to lighten. Dawn spread slowly across the horizon, turning the river silver beneath the first traces of morning. The air smelled clean after the storm. Cool. Quiet. The city had not fully awakened yet. Traffic was sparse. Streetlights still glowed along the waterfront. Behind me, dozens of people remained inside the tower preparing for the day ahead. Independent inspections would begin within hours. Compliance teams were already reviewing records. Field supervisors were coordinating site visits. The work was only starting. Yet for the first time in nearly 20 hours, I felt something close to relief. My phone vibrated before I reached the parking garage. A message from the chief executive appeared on the screen. Simple. Direct. Thank you for staying. I stared at it for a moment. Then slipped the phone back into my pocket. The elevator carried me down to the lower levels. The hum of the machinery echoed softly through the steel walls. Everything felt strangely calm now. Maybe because the crisis had been interrupted before it could unfold. Maybe because the truth no longer needed to fight for attention. When I reached my car, another notification arrived. This one came from one of the field supervisors who had joined the conference call earlier. A group message had been created overnight. More than 30 names filled the participant list. Engineers. Technicians. Maintenance leads. Operations staff. The people whose reports had spent months buried inside archives. The newest message contained a photograph. Daylight crews arriving at the primary facility. Trucks lined the access road. Workers carried equipment cases toward the inspection area. Beneath the image was a single sentence. Feels good to finally be heard. I sat quietly for a moment before starting the engine. Those 6 words stayed with me. The city slowly came to life as I drove home. Coffee shops opened their doors. Delivery trucks rolled through intersections. Morning commuters filled sidewalks. Nobody around me knew how close the company had come to making a costly mistake. Nobody knew how many conversations had taken place overnight. And that was fine. Success in infrastructure often looks invisible. When things work correctly, most people never think about them at all. A few hours later, after less sleep than I probably needed, my phone began vibrating again. Inspection updates. Operation summaries. Compliance notifications. I opened the first report while sunlight streamed through the kitchen window. Independent engineers had reached the facility. Initial findings confirmed the concerns raised by field teams. Access restrictions created unacceptable delays. Emergency response routes required immediate redesign. Additional vulnerabilities were identified during the inspection. None of it was surprising anymore. The evidence had been there all along. Another message followed. Then another. Around noon, the chief executive shared a company-wide announcement. Every employee would receive it. I read the statement carefully. It acknowledged the reporting failures. It announced the suspension of the project. It committed to a full review. But one section stood out above everything else. Recognition would be given to employees whose concerns helped prevent the activation from moving forward. I read that sentence twice. Then a third time. The names had not been forgotten. Later that afternoon, a video meeting connected employees from offices, facilities, and field sites across the region. Hundreds joined. Maybe more. The chief executive appeared on screen looking tired but sincere. He spoke about accountability. About listening. About trust. Then he did something nobody expected. Instead of ending with executives, he invited several field supervisors to speak. One by one they shared their experiences. Maintenance concerns. Inspection observations. Delayed responses. Nobody interrupted them. Nobody rushed them. The meeting lasted longer than scheduled. Nobody seemed to mind. When it ended, the feeling was different from any corporate presentation I had ever attended. Less polished. More honest. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the city, I looked once more at the photograph from the maintenance crew. Bright lights. Reflective jackets. Ordinary people standing beside equipment that served thousands of lives every day. Months earlier their warnings had been treated like background noise. Now their voices had changed the direction of an entire company. And somewhere between the storm, the reports, the sleepless night, and the hard conversations, something else had changed too. The people in charge had finally remembered that the strongest signal inside any organization rarely comes from the top. It comes from the people closest to the truth. 3 days later, the atmosphere inside the company felt completely different. The urgency had not disappeared. If anything, it had become more focused. Conference rooms that once hosted budget discussions were now filled with engineers, compliance teams, and operations specialists rebuilding plans from the ground up. Every proposal was questioned. Every assumption was tested. Every recommendation required evidence. The change was visible everywhere. I noticed it the moment I stepped into headquarters that morning. People were listening more carefully. Asking better questions. Taking fewer shortcuts. Sunlight poured through the glass atrium, reflecting off polished floors and steel railings. Employees crossed the lobby carrying tablets and folders, but the mood felt lighter than it had in months. Not because everything was fixed. Because people finally trusted that concerns would be heard. My phone buzzed while I waited for the elevator. A calendar invitation appeared on the screen. Executive review meeting. 9 o'clock sharp. Mandatory attendance. I stepped into the elevator and watched the floor numbers climb. When the doors opened, several familiar faces were already moving toward the boardroom. The lawyer carried a thick binder beneath one arm. The operations director balanced 2 cups of coffee. Even the chief executive looked more rested than he had during the storm. The meeting began exactly on time. No dramatic announcements. No speeches. Just work. Inspection findings filled the first hour. Independent engineers confirmed every major concern that field teams had reported. Access routes required redesign. Emergency response times needed improvement. Several contractor recommendations would be replaced entirely. Nobody challenged the findings. The evidence was too clear. Around mid-morning, the compliance director entered carrying another folder. The room grew quieter immediately. Everyone understood what that meant. Investigations had continued around the clock. New information had surfaced. She opened the folder and distributed copies across the table. Paper slid softly over polished wood. "The review is complete," she said. The chief executive nodded. "Proceed." Her voice remained professional. Calm. The audit confirms repeated suppression of critical reporting channels. Nobody looked surprised anymore. That stage had passed. Now came accountability. The compliance director continued outlining findings. Approval chains. Archived communications. Internal directives. Months of decisions traced line by line. I glanced toward Richard Hale. He sat at the far end of the table. Quiet. Still. He looked very different from the man who had once controlled every conversation in the room. Not defeated. Reflective. For the first time, he seemed to understand the full weight of what had happened. When the review ended, the room remained silent for several seconds. Then something unexpected happened. Richard stood. No one interrupted him. He looked around the table slowly. At the executives. The engineers. The operations staff. Finally his eyes settled on me. "I thought I was protecting the project," he said. His voice was lower than usual. I convinced myself delays were a bigger threat than uncertainty. Nobody moved. I stopped listening to people who knew more than I did. The words hung in the air. Honest. Uncomfortable. Real. He exhaled slowly. That mistake belongs to me. Outside the windows, bright sunlight reflected across the river. The storm felt very far away now. Yet its lessons remained. The chief executive studied him for a moment before speaking. Then learn from it. The response was simple. No anger. No triumph. Just truth. Richard nodded once and sat back down. The meeting moved forward. Action plans replaced arguments. Solutions replaced assumptions. As discussions continued, I found myself looking around the room. Engineers sat beside executives. Field supervisors joined remotely from facilities across the region. People who once worked in separate worlds were finally solving problems together. And in that moment I realized the company had avoided more than a costly mistake. It had escaped something quieter and more dangerous. The belief that authority mattered more than truth. The people closest to the work had changed the outcome. Not because they held the most power. Because they refused to stop speaking when something felt wrong. The following week brought a rhythm that felt unfamiliar. Not because the work had slowed down. It had not. If anything, the pace increased. Inspection teams moved between facilities. Engineers revised designs. Operations managers reviewed contingency plans. Yet beneath all of it was something new. Trust was beginning to rebuild. I noticed it during meetings. Questions that once sounded defensive now sounded curious. Employees who had spent years staying quiet started speaking earlier and more often. Small changes. Important ones. Late one afternoon I found myself back in the same boardroom where everything had changed. Sunlight stretched across the long conference table in bands of gold. The river beyond the windows shimmered beneath a clear sky. It was hard to believe a storm had filled that same view only days earlier. The chief executive stood near the screen reviewing updated project plans. Around him sat engineers, compliance staff, field supervisors, and department heads. No separate groups. No invisible hierarchy. Just people working through problems together. The redesigned infrastructure proposal appeared on the screen. Emergency access routes had been expanded. Response times improved. Independent reviews added. Multiple verification checkpoints inserted before any future activation could move forward. Every recommendation reflected lessons learned. Every page carried evidence that someone had listened. As the presentation ended, a field supervisor joined remotely from the primary facility. His camera showed bright afternoon sunlight reflecting off equipment yards behind him. He smiled when he saw the final plans. "That will work," he said. The room grew quiet. It was not the approval of an executive. It was something more meaningful. It was approval from someone who would actually stand beside that equipment every day. Several people nodded. The chief executive smiled faintly. "Good." The supervisor hesitated before speaking again. "There is something else." The room waited. He glanced down briefly. Then back toward the camera. "People at the facility wanted me to say thank you." Nobody spoke. For the first time in a long time, they feel like their voices matter. The words landed gently. Yet they carried enormous weight. I looked around the room. A few people lowered their eyes. Others sat quietly reflecting. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Some moments deserve space. The chief executive finally folded his hands. Their voices always mattered. The supervisor offered a small smile. Now they know it. The meeting ended shortly afterward. People gathered their notes and laptops. Conversations. continued in smaller groups as employees filtered toward elevators and hallways. I remained by the window for a moment, watching sunlight dance across the river below. Footsteps approached. Richard stopped beside me. Neither of us spoke immediately. The city stretched beyond the glass. Busy. Unaware. Ordinary. You could have stayed quiet, he said finally. His voice carried none of the certainty it once had. A lot of people would have. I watched a ferry move slowly across the water. Maybe. He nodded. But you did not. The silence returned. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. After a moment he extended his hand. I shook it. Nothing dramatic. No speeches. No grand reconciliation. Just acknowledgement. Sometimes that is enough. As evening settled over the city, the lights inside the building began turning on one floor at a time. Desks glowed softly behind glass walls. Employees continued working. Planning. Building. Improving. The company still had challenges ahead. Every organization does. But something fundamental had changed. People were no longer afraid to raise concerns. Leaders were no longer assuming they had all the answers. And somewhere beyond the boardroom, beyond the reports, beyond the investigations and redesigned plans, the most important lesson remained. Progress begins the moment people choose to value truth more than pride. 2 weeks later, the changes were no longer confined to conference rooms or policy documents. They had become visible in everyday moments. Walking through headquarters felt different. Employees stopped to exchange ideas instead of avoiding difficult conversations. Managers spent more time asking questions and less time giving answers. The shift was subtle, but impossible to miss once you noticed it. That afternoon, sunlight poured through the upper floors of the building, filling hallways with warm reflections. I stepped out of a meeting and glanced across the atrium below. Groups of employees gathered around tables discussing project updates. Engineers sat beside operations teams. Compliance staff reviewed plans with field supervisors. Boundaries that once felt permanent had quietly faded. My phone vibrated with a calendar. Reminder. Employee recognition event. Main auditorium. 3 o'clock. I almost forgot about it. The previous weeks had been filled with inspections, redesigns, and reviews. Recognition felt secondary compared to everything else. Yet as I made my way toward the auditorium, I realized why the event mattered. Hundreds of employees filled the room. Some wore business attire. Others arrived directly from field assignments wearing company jackets and work boots. Conversations echoed softly beneath the high ceiling. The atmosphere felt relaxed. Genuine. On the stage, a large screen displayed photographs collected during the review process. Maintenance crews. Inspection teams. Operations staff. Ordinary moments from ordinary workdays. The chief executive stepped to the podium. The room gradually settled into silence. He spoke briefly about lessons learned. About accountability. About improvement. But he spent very little time talking about leadership. Instead, he focused on the people who raised concerns when it would have been easier to stay silent. One by one, names appeared on the screen. Engineers. Technicians. Supervisors. Analysts. Employees from every level of the company. Each received recognition for helping prevent a costly mistake. Applause filled the room again and again. Not the polite applause often heard at corporate events. Something warmer. More personal. Then a familiar photograph appeared. The maintenance crew standing beneath bright work lights beside the primary facility. The same photograph I had looked at countless times. The audience applauded immediately. Several workers in the front rows laughed and shook their heads as co-workers nudged them playfully. Their expressions carried equal parts pride and embarrassment. The chief executive smiled. These individuals reminded us that expertise does not depend on titles. The applause grew louder. I looked around the room. Many executives were standing. So were department heads. Engineers. Contractors. Everyone. The recognition felt earned because it was. After the event ended, employees lingered in small groups throughout the auditorium. Conversations continued long after the stage lights dimmed. Near the exit, one of the maintenance supervisors approached me. He held a paper coffee cup and wore the same reflective jacket I remembered from the photographs. "Funny how things work out," he said. I smiled. "How so?" He glanced toward the stage. "A month ago most people did not know who we were." I looked back at the crowd. "They know now." He laughed softly. "Maybe. But that is not the important part." I waited. He took a sip of coffee before answering. "The important part is they finally listened." The words stayed with me long after he walked away. Later that evening, as the sun settled beyond the river and golden light filled the windows of headquarters, I stood quietly overlooking the city. Cars moved through intersections below. Ferries crossed the water. People went about their lives without realizing how many unseen systems worked together around them every day. Somewhere in those systems were countless individuals doing careful work that rarely received attention. And perhaps that was the lesson none of us would forget. Real progress does not begin when powerful people speak. It begins when ordinary people are willing to tell the truth and someone finally chooses to hear it. Several months passed. Seasons shifted almost unnoticed. The urgency that once filled conference rooms slowly gave way to routine, and routine gave way to something stronger. Stability. The redesigned infrastructure plan had been fully implemented. Independent reviews became standard practice. New reporting systems ensured concerns reached decision-makers quickly. The changes were not dramatic anymore. They were simply part of how things worked. One quiet evening, I found myself standing near the same river that had reflected storm clouds on the night everything changed. The water moved steadily beneath the fading sunlight. Ferries crossed the channel. Office lights flickered on one building at a time. The city carried on as it always had. Yet I could not look at it the same way. My phone vibrated softly. A message from the operations director appeared on the screen. Attached was a photograph. I smiled immediately. It showed the primary facility during a routine inspection. Fresh pavement lined the access routes. New emergency gates stood ready. Maintenance vehicles moved freely through the area. Everything looked ordinary. That was the point. The systems worked. The people supporting them worked. The risks that once hid beneath paperwork and assumptions had been addressed. Beneath the photograph was a short message. "Thought you would appreciate seeing this." I looked at the image for a long moment. Then slipped the phone back into my pocket. The evening air carried the scent of water and distant rain. Somewhere behind me, conversations drifted from outdoor restaurants along the waterfront. Life moved forward. A few days later, I attended a regional planning meeting hosted at headquarters. Representatives from multiple facilities joined. Engineers shared updates. Supervisors reviewed performance reports. Employees presented ideas for future improvements. The atmosphere felt completely different from the company I remembered months earlier. During a break, I noticed a familiar face. One of the maintenance supervisors from the primary facility stood near a coffee station speaking with several young engineers. They listened carefully as he described challenges they might never encounter in an office. Practical details. Real conditions. Lessons earned through experience. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody looked distracted. They listened. As they should. Before leaving, the supervisor caught my eye and smiled. "Things are better," he said. I glanced around the room. "They are." He nodded once. "People talk to each other now." Such a simple observation. Yet it explained everything. Later that evening, after the meeting ended, I walked through the nearly empty building. Soft light reflected across polished floors. Most employees had already gone home. The city glowed beyond the glass walls. Near the main lobby stood a display installed only weeks earlier. Photographs from across the company rotated slowly across a digital screen. Engineers. Analysts. Operators. Maintenance crews. Field supervisors. No titles. No rankings. Just people. Above the images appeared a single sentence. "The strength of a system depends on those willing to protect it." I stood there for a moment. Quietly. Thinking about the storm. The reports. The sleepless night. The workers who refused to stop speaking. The leaders who finally chose to listen. In the end, nobody saved the company alone. Not executives. Not engineers. Not compliance teams. Not field crews. Everyone played a part. That was the lesson hidden inside the entire experience. Real leadership is not about having every answer. Real leadership begins when people are humble enough to hear the truth, no matter where it comes from. Outside, the last light of day faded beyond the river. The city continued shining beneath the darkening sky. Cars moved through distant streets. Ferries crossed silent water. And somewhere inside systems most people would never notice, thousands of lives continued uninterrupted because ordinary people chose integrity over comfort, responsibility over silence, and truth over pride. The storm was gone. The lesson remained.